Hi and welcome to another episode of Research in Profile, brought to you by the School of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Queensland. My name is Sebastian Kaempf and I'm joined here by my colleague Dr. Tim Aistrope. Tim, who has recently finished his PhD in the school and is now working as a lecturer here at POLSIS. Tim, you are here because you have just published your new book entitled Conspiracy Theory and American Foreign Policy, which has been published by Manchester University Press. So first of all, congratulations on the publication.
Thanks, Seb.
And thanks for coming in here. The first question I want to ask you is most obviously about the title, because I find it really intriguing. Conspiracy Theory and American Foreign Policy. Conspiracy theory, what got you interested in that topic?
Well, I've had a long-standing interest in popular culture and its intersection with international politics. And it turns out that one of the key themes in contemporary pop culture around international politics is conspiracies, secret plots, plans to unseat governments, spy intrigues, and so on. And yet there's not been a lot written about that in international politics. So there's that intersection which initially sparked my interest. As well as that, there's a burgeoning interest in paranoia in popular culture and the way that might influence or undermine democracy. And I'm writing in the American context, and there's a lot of that, and it comes up. Richard Hofstadter famously wrote a piece called The Paranoid Style in American Politics, and references to the paranoid style are everywhere in political commentary around American politics. And recently with Donald Trump emerging as a leading candidate for the Republican nomination, that discourse has been activated again. So I had that interest, and that sparked me initially. And I suppose more broadly, once I started looking into conspiracy a little bit more, and sparked by this pop culture interest, there was a double-edgedness to it, because we know that there really are conspiracies, states plot in secret together and against each other. There are covert interventions. Intelligence agencies have programs of rendition and interrogation and black sites and other things. And there's a lot of stuff on the war on terror about that. So there are conspiracies. On the other hand, there are people with far-fetched claims about international politics and the conspiracies that go on. So there's a double-edgedness to it, and that, I think, is an interesting opening. So which conspiracies are real, which are paranoid, and who decides, which are plausible and which are unconsiderable.
Yeah, no, and I think that's interesting that you link this to the topic of conspiracy theory to American foreign policy. And in your book, you comment on how 9/11 became a date around which a lot of paranoia and conspiracies evolved. And as other commentators have also pointed towards, maybe the rise of digital new media technology has helped in the proliferation of conspiracies and paranoia. Now, as I said, your book focuses more closely on American foreign policy and what you actually coin the Arab Muslim paranoia narrative. So the Arab Muslim paranoia narrative. What is that narrative, and why did you choose to focus on it?
So after 9/11, there was a lot of interest in explaining why the terrorists had attacked New York and Washington, and explaining what were the drivers of that. And people pointed to widespread anti-Americanism across the Middle East. There was a lot of polling done, and it turned out that there was widespread resentment about American foreign policy and other things. So an attempt to explain that resentment pointed towards the cultural drivers of anti-Americanism, amongst which the paranoid perception of American power was a regular feature of that discourse. So what I'm focusing on is the way the paranoid and anti-Americanism are linked in post 9/11 foreign policy discourse, which is what I call the Arab Muslim paranoia narrative. And this made its way into foreign policy commentary, as I said, just directly after 9/11, and work from, say, Thomas Friedman or Fareed Zakaria, Bernard Lewis. Lots of people had this feature of their explanation, the cultural drivers of terrorism, and that subsequently made its way into the Bush administration's war of ideas and into American public diplomacy efforts that attempted to undermine those cultural drivers of terrorism. So it's an interesting narrative to examine, because it's traceable and you can follow it through all these different sites in the war and terror discourse, and even on into contemporary attempts to counter violent extremism. The digital outreach team is a public diplomacy vehicle that the State Department has run, and it's carried on into the Obama administration, and it takes many of the same frames into its operational practices.
Now, given your focus on paranoia and on conspiracy, these are like very difficult topics to grasp, right? They're kind of tangible, intangible. What is a conspiracy? There's definitional and conceptual issues, as you point out in the book. So one of the questions I'm interested in is, how do you go about researching that kind of topic? How do you go about researching paranoia and conspiracy theory?
Well, the initial phase of it was to read everything that had been written about that. And once I did that, it became evident that there is a great deal of disagreement about what it might mean. And in fact, a lot of the scholars more recently have pointed to the real problems with using it at all. At the very least, we can say there's a lot of power and context and intuition involved in the application of that terminology. And that points to the relationship between power and knowledge in foreign policy for me. So I took that as an incitement. So there's an initial discovery phase, and once I got into that, I realized that, particularly when you start going across cultures and talking about foreign policy, the power dynamics are the more interesting element of that. So that ended up being the focus of the book. Instead of trying to explain why people have crazy beliefs, I started looking at the identification of those beliefs by people in power and the sort of practices that supports, and analysing how that came up and manifested and what the political and ideological ramifications of that might have been. So I guess that was the starting point. And then what I did is I developed a framework for doing that analysis, drawing on post-colonial theory and Foucauldian influences around power and knowledge and discourse and discursive regimes. And then I applied that approach to post 9/11 foreign policy commentary, and looked at the ways that 9/11 was explained by key foreign policy commentators. And then I did a discourse analysis on that. I followed that, traced that discourse through that the Arab Muslim paranoia narrative and the surrounding discourse through into Bush administration foreign policy documents, the National Security Statement, the National Strategy for Combating Terrorism, and then on into public diplomacy programs at the State Department. And so basically what I did is I looked at the ideological context in which that narrative arose, and used it as a window into those underlying assumptions, and as a critical way of looking at what was unarticulated in foreign policy discourse around those programs and perspectives.
Yeah, fascinating. I want to hear in a second quite a bit more about the empirical findings of those two case studies that you're doing in the book. But first I wanted to go back to the theoretical framework and the way you conceptually approached that research, and was wondering what the big major theoretical or conceptual findings are that come out of your book in that part.
Well, the argument is that it's a delegitimizing discourse that helps reproduce an American identity, a particular American identity, as benign and largely misunderstood in the world, and particularly in the Middle East, and to that extent dampens down criticism of American foreign policy and helps buttress an orthodoxy. So that's the sort of key argument. But the broader point and the broader significance is that legitimizing and productive process is rooted in deep cultural scripts that are embedded in the American political tradition. Now, I trace the Arab Muslim paranoia discourse back to the way that paranoia was first emerged as a subject of concern in post-Second World War accounts of extremism. And I start with Richard Hofstadter, but I follow that through and show that there's a powerful liberal discourse which problematizes thought and contrasts that with a stable political centre. So you have an irrational fringe full of problematic thought and backward culture, and a political centre where right-minded politics occurs. And I trace that imaginary through and then connected it with a powerful post-9/11 discourse. I showed how long-standing Orientalist narratives around the Western encounter with the Middle East and more broadly folded together quite neatly with that liberal imaginary. And in fact, there is a lot of common ground. There's a lot of scholarship done on the common ground between those perspectives. And so showing how those deep cultural scripts, in fact, informed the way that post-9/11 foreign policy was articulated and identity was legitimated as a key finding. So I guess broadly you'd say that we can't separate our own political culture from the kind of world we encounter. We're always on the inside. We're always articulated and informed by those cultural practices.
Fascinating. So what you're basically saying is that the idea of paranoia and conspiracy theory is something that we find embedded in a particular political culture, in this case in American foreign policy or policy-making culture.
Yeah, so it's certainly true that there are all sorts of erroneous beliefs about American foreign policy, and nobody's questioning that. But the way in which those erroneous beliefs are articulated and understood has more to do with our own political culture and the way those sorts of things have come up in our political culture, on the one hand. And two, that those instances of erroneous belief are used to extrapolate out that reading of erroneous culture as paranoid to the Middle East at large, to Muslim culture at large, and taps into this broader account of the problems that Arab Muslim people might have as endemic, and it ties into a whole wider discourse. But we can talk about the way thought is problematized, extremism, violence is tied to problematic thought, and that problematic thought lies below the surface in a wide array of beliefs that aren't necessarily violent, but be pointed to and said, well, that's problematic. That's the ideational precursor to some sort of violence. And so when you start talking about whole cultures in that way, it's very problematic, and that's really the subject of my critique.
Amazing. Okay, let's go into the two empirical studies that you've done as part of this big, fascinating inquiry. And you focus, as I said, on two case studies. The first one is an analysis of foreign policy experts in the United States in the context of terrorism. And the second one analyzes the Bush administration's counterterrorism policies. So the first question on these two cases is why those particular cases? And I'll come to the second question in a second.
Well, I started with the post-9/11 foreign policy commentary because I was interested to see how, in the wake of such a catastrophic event, which required explanation and required foreign policy experts and everyday people to give an account of why it happened, to articulate what at the time was perhaps beyond articulation. So there's a lot of stuff around the event and how that plays out in international politics. So I thought, well, this is a good site for looking at the way a narrative is formed, and that formation process that year after 9/11 is sort of a snapshot moment. So I wanted to see how that narrative came up at that time, because to some extent that's forming that's at the ground level of the war and terror discourse, and that's the formation moment. And so I was very interested to see how prominent foreign policy commentators had talked about Arab Muslim anti-Americanism and the associations that they drew. And then for the second case study, showing that this narrative and this way of articulating Arab Muslim anti-Americanism actually became a key concern in a national security context was very important, because it would be easy enough to say, well, this is what some people thought about it, but what's the significance of that? Well, it's quite significant when you find conspiracy theory linked to countering violent extremism. Because conspiracy theory, as we've discussed, is so ambiguous, so loaded. It's not what you'd think would be in the sober strategic language of the national security statement. And so that opens up a window into the underlying assumptions, the unarticulated, unthought, unexpressed, ideological underpinnings and cultural resonances that are in those documents. And so showing that was there was quite important, and then cascading that along into the actual practice of dealing with resentment towards America from Arab Muslim people, Muslims at large, in State Department public diplomacy programs. I look at a group called the Counter Misinformation Team and another group called the Digital Outreach Team, who explicitly engage with what they take to be problematic views about American foreign policy, and the way in which that's framed and the way in which their encounters unfold, and so showing in practice what the consequences of that narrative are, and so on is that's really the reason for going there.
Nice. I mean, you already started giving us quite strong glimpses of what's happening in these two case studies, but I want to encourage you to maybe give us a quick sense of what the key findings in each of those are, because they're very, very ultimately really fascinating.
So in the post 9/11 case study, I did two things. First, I established what I call a conspiracy discourse. By that I mean a broad field of narratives about conspiracy, some of which were framed as paranoid and irrational, and some of which were taken for granted as the groundwork of the war on terror discourse. So on the one hand, you have claims about blowback, about links to despotic regimes in the Middle East, the Mujahideen, other things which are covert, conspiratorial. They're the secret history of America's involvement in the Middle East. Or, on the other hand, identitarian accounts of the motives of 9/11 that pointed to sleeper cells spread out across our cities and ticking time bombs waiting to go off. But these are authoritative accounts. And on the other hand, you have accounts that are taken to be irrational and beyond the pale. So I established this conspiracy discourse, and I talk about the way in which authority is established in some claims, and other claims are thought to be beyond consideration. So that's the starting point. And then in my discourse analysis of the Arab Muslim paranoia narrative as it came up in key foreign policy texts, I focus in on some texts from Foreign Affairs, from Fuad Ajami and Michael Scott Doran, who are really top foreign policy scholars. So it's I take their views seriously, but it's interesting to analyse the way that narrative comes up in their very interesting accounts. And then also perhaps more journalistic accounts from people like Fareed Zakaria and Thomas Friedman. So I do a discourse analysis on that, and basically the finding there is that, as I said earlier, it's a delegitimizing practice, but on the other hand, it legitimizes as a particular identity. And so we can say very obviously in some respects that if you call somebody paranoid, irrational conspiracy theorist, it points people's attentions away from the content of specific claims and towards the deeper psychological or cultural dysfunction that might be motivating those claims. And so that's a delegitimizing moment. But there's always that contrast with the true identity who can make that determination on the subject of those claims, which is, all the more sober and sane and sensible for the contrast. So that's the key discourse analysis finding.
Awesome. Fascinating.
Yeah.
If we take all of this together, right, this fascinating insight and analysis into paranoia, into conspiracy theory, US foreign policy post 9/11, and the Arab Muslim paranoia narrative, even if we step back for a little bit and then think about, okay, so all of this, what does that mean for the way in which we as scholars or as publics are thinking about world politics?
So as far as conspiracy theory and paranoia goes, it's an intervention in an emerging scholarship around conspiracy theory and paranoia, which is often and continues to be about an explanation of the backwards and irrational views of Middle Easterners and other things and the policy implications of that. Instead of doing that, I've looked at the ideological context in which those claims about the beliefs of other people emerge. And so it's an incitement to think carefully about the way we frame and understand our others and the resentment towards foreign policy. And that plays out in my critique of public diplomacy, which is, again, highlighting the way that those deep cultural scripts can impact upon our ability to have dialogue and exchange and influence, and in fact undermines that whole aspiration. And so perhaps finally it's about legitimacy and illegitimacy, And the point being that those things aren't produced in a vacuum. They're deeply embedded. They have histories, and we need to historicise our contemporary moments to understand the sources of the legitimacy and illegitimacy that we might be analysing. And so that's probably the broader point of the book.
Amazing. This is definitely worth your read. Big topics, fascinating concepts, and an in-depth analysis of fascinating element of US foreign policy post 9/11. If you're interested in reading this book, you will find the link to it underneath this video. I want to thank you for tuning in, and particularly I want to thank Dr. Tim Aistrope for being here. If you want to find out more about the research we do here in the School of Political Science and International Studies, you can equally find that link underneath this video. Thank you very much, and see you next time.